Welcome and good morning. Thank you for joining us for worship here at Westminster United Methodist Church Online. My name is Malcolm, Pastor Malcolm, and I have the opportunity to serve with an amazing paid staff as well as a fantastic Christian family that together comprises our congregation here at Center&Main. We are changing lives through Jesus Christ to make a difference. And this summer, we're going inward to work on our own spiritual disciplines and practices that we hope will align our hearts with God's heart and also our heart for the community. We're doing this as we're traveling through the ancient lands of the Celts, Ireland, Northern England, Scotland, and Wales. We're learning and putting into practice some of the earliest Christian spiritual disciplines which celebrate the everyday moments of life. Today, we're talking about thresholds. I'm standing here in the doorway of our sanctuary, standing on top of the threshold, if you will, which sits at the base of the door. And as you know, thresholds serve a purpose. They anchor the door. They keep out moisture, and they become a barrier from the outside world into the safeness of our inside of our homes. Thresholds are also metaphorically moments between what was and what is to be. It is stepping from one moment of time into another, from one existence to a new possibility. Now, the ancient Celts celebrated thresholds, and it's no wonder that the Christian Celtic community picked up the spiritual practice of becoming aware of the many thresholds that God may be presenting to each and every one of us each and every single day throughout the day. Today, we meet two women who sit at a threshold. One is at the end of a long life, and the other who is very young and whose life seems to be coming to an end, an untimely end, way too early. And so, my friends, let us prepare our hearts and minds for worship this day and step from the secular world into the sacred. If you have a candle with you inside your worship space there at home, we invite you to light that candle during our prelude and welcome the Holy Spirit amongst us. Come, let's worship together.
Good morning, I'm Greg Luke, and I'm a member here at Westminster United Methodist Church. Please join me in our call to worship this morning, responding where it says all. Where is the threshold to your home? It is the place where I live. Could it also be the garden where you sit in the summer? It is also in the country in which I live, or perhaps the church where you worship. It is where my heart is at rest. And where is your heart mostly at rest? It is when we turn to God in prayer, so where I pray is my home. Please join me in our gathering prayer this morning. Christ in our coming and in our leaving, the door and keeper, for us and our dear ones, this day and every day, blessing for always. We call upon the sacred three to save, shield, and surround this gathering, this home, this day, and every day forever to come. Amen.
God will take care of Good morning, boys and girls. I'm going to invite you guys to come on down to the screen and join me for the kids' time this morning. Today we're talking about a very important place and thing that exists in every single home, and those are called thresholds. Many years ago, I had graduated, and a friend of mine thought that I would be knocking on a lot of doors and meeting a lot of people, and so he went ahead and he bought me this wonderful poster. It's got a bunch of doors all over it. Each door is a little different. You can see that this one has sort of like columns around it, and but at the base of each door is this thing that's called a threshold. The threshold has a very particular purpose on a house. It actually keeps moisture out of the house, and oftentimes they're slanted at an angle. So if it's raining outside, the rain will hit the door and then the water will go down and then it'll be shunned away from the house. My friend thought I would be knocking on some of these doors. This is actually, as I said, in Washington, D.C. You have a threshold on your own house, and what I'd like for you to do is to look for it when you go outside the house the next time. It'll be probably a metal plate or maybe a wooden plate that is at the bottom of your doorway. And you'll probably notice, just like the one that we have at our house, and here's a photo of that. Dun, 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 dun. You'll notice that there's a little bit of an angle on our bottom plate, and that does exactly what I said earlier. It makes sure that water can't come in the house. Today we're talking about appreciation for thresholds because they are oftentimes associated with doors. And in fact, I went around the community and I took a few photos of some various doors. I couldn't get necessarily right up close to look, but I bet you'll recognize maybe a few of these buildings. Dun, 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 dun. These are doors that go into places of learning. They're schools, elementary school, middle school, high school. Perhaps you recognize them. And the threshold there is stepping from your world into a world of learning. And I know that many of you have been missing your schools, and we're hoping that we can go back this fall. But if we don't, we'll find another way to continue to learn in our own homes, probably again. I went by another building and I took another picture of another entrance, and let's see if you know what this one is. Dun, 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 dun. Yes, that's the hospital. Very good. Yeah, that's Carroll Hospital Center, and I took a picture of the doorway, and while there's a big sign on there that says visitors can't come in right now, people can go if they're sick. And as they step over the threshold, they're going from not being well to a place where they can be made well by doctors and nurses who care for them. And so oftentimes people will go to a hospital because they need somebody to care for them. Here's another doorway that you may be familiar with. Dun, 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 dun. Yes, this is the church. This is another place of healing. It's a place where we come and we heal as a community together, and we trust in God. When you come to the church, you'll notice there's a stairway and there's a little metal plate there, and that helps to anchor the doors. As you walk over that plate, you'll walk up some more stairs and you'll see these sets of doors. Dun, dun, dun. See, as you walk up to these doors, you won't notice a metal plate. In actual fact, the plate or the threshold is still there, but you can't see it because it's covered with carpet. And oftentimes we talk about when we come inside the sanctuary, you're leaving what is called the world or the secular world or and you step into a sacred space, a special place, the sanctuary. It's a place that we come and we celebrate together and we praise God. And I know that we haven't been able to come here lately, and I know that most times when you walk across that threshold, your parents are probably sitting there telling you to be quiet, stop making so much noise. Shh. Guess what? I don't mind it if you make noise. It's all good. But listen to your parents all the same. Anyways, I have another threshold that I wanted to show you, and this one is a little unique. Let's see if you can figure this one out. Dun, 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 dun. Now you're probably saying, but Pastor Malcolm, that's the baptismal font. That's not a threshold. That's a threshold of a different kind. You see, at the baptismal font is a place where we baptize children and adults. And in this case, maybe your parents brought you when you were very young and they made some promises that they would raise you in the Christian faith. And so the baptismal font is a threshold as you become welcomed as a child of God into the family of God. And so this baptismal font is a threshold because you're going from what once was to what is to be and to becoming a Christian, because later on in life you'll have an opportunity to celebrate and accept the vows that your parents made on their behalf when you were baptized. And so the baptismal font is a threshold for all of us. And so, my friends, this is what I want you to do this week. I want you to look around and be aware of the thresholds that exist around you when you cross from one place to another. Make sure you give thanks to God for the place that you're going. Many years ago, my mother cross-stitched two pictures. She had a business and she was often cross-stitching. In fact, I have many pictures from my mom over the years, and since she passed, we received a lot of those. But there were two that were particularly special. She had cross-stitched Jackie's and my names, and in there, she actually put what our name meant, and a scripture text and a small picture. And I wanted to show you this this drawing here. This is sort of like just a picture of what it looks like. I'm gonna try to put that in the video, but I don't wanna spend too much time messing about with it. But there's my name, and underneath it says, underneath Malcolm, it says, man of peace, go figure. And then it has a quote, blessed are the peacemakers. I knew that my name is a Latinized spelling of a Gaelic name, which I would really mess up if I tried to pronounce it. But that Gaelic name means disciple of St. Columba. And then I thought, I wonder who St. Columba is. Well, St. Columba is known in Ireland as one of the three patron saints of Ireland. And his name in Ireland, he's often referred to as Comciel, which means church dove. And along with St. Patrick and St. Bridget, St. Columba or Comciel is one of the three patron saints. He was born in Llanelmid, which is near Lake Loch Garden in County Garden. And in my cross stitch, as I said, there is a visual image of a dove bearing an olive branch, which is the connection between my name, being a follower of St. Columba, or peacemaker in this case. Anyways, there's a little mosaic of what Columba may have looked like. Early in his life, he wasn't much of a peacemaker. In actual fact, he was the great-great-grandson of one of the high kings of Ireland, a 5th century high king of Ireland. And while he was baptized into the Christian faith, Colmcille had a bit of a temper. At one point, there was a disagreement over a local king, tribal king, in his community about a transcription of a book that he was working in the scriptorium. And he kind of was under the impression that that book would become part of his own personal library. However, the king said, no, it's not going to become part of that. A battle ensued involving the deaths of many Christians, all over a manuscript. When the battle was over and done, the consideration was that Colmcille should have been excommunicated. One of the saints of the day argued on his behalf. And it was made from the standpoint that, in actual fact, the tensions were existing between these two political kings in this region. Colmcille was on the wrong side, chose the wrong king to support because he lost in the battle. However, Colmcille was judged not excommunicatable, but in actual fact was told that he would have to pay penance for his sin. Colmcille really lamented the number of deaths over this manuscript, particularly of Christian brothers. And so he took on his penance that he would banish himself from Ireland, his native land, and he would go and live in what was at that time the western coast of Scotland and a small island called Iona. As it turns out, Columba was quite accomplished when he arrived into Scotland. He was a great evangelist for the Celtic Christianity on that western coast, setting up his home base in Iona, where he actually set up an abbey. And from there, he controlled both the religion as well as the political empire of Celtic Christianity. He became known as the Apostle of the Picts, which is kind of interesting because just a couple centuries earlier, Caesar in Rome went ahead and built Hadrian's Wall. And this wall was intended, it's on the northern part of what was considered then the Roman Empire, and it was built to keep those Picts and Scots out because they were considered untamable. When St. Columba arrived in Scotland, he was able to go ahead and evangelize the Scots and the Picts so that they took on much of the feel and the life of Celtic Christianity. Throughout St. Columba's life, he faced many thresholds. Some did not lead in the direction that one would have hoped, such as the death of, hundreds of Christians over a manuscript. But out of a decision that was made by St. Columba to exile himself and to form a Celtic Christian community that spread through much of Scotland, and out of this one small island known as Iona, which, by the way, we'll be learning more about Iona in the future and St. Columba's life there and the mission that continues to this day, even after 1,400 years of being established. His influence is legendary. As mentioned at the top of our service today, though, we'll be following along two stories of two women and a man. This is two women, Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham. They all stand at a threshold of walking by in faith over the reality of life. The first woman's name that we'll be talking about is Sarah. She is married to Abraham for a long time. Sadly, Sarah and Abraham were childless. Their story begins in Genesis chapter 12, when Abram and Sarai are promised by God that if they left everything that they ever knew in their land that they were raised, and they would go to the land that God was promising them, that God would make them the mother and father of a great nation. Their descendants would be more than they could count. The reality of the situation is, though, is that both Abram and Sarah were beyond childbearing years. And so it was by faith that they did as God had promised. And upon arriving in the land, and there's several chapters for them to get there, that would be flowing with milk and honey, they stood at the threshold of the reality and faith, and they stood and decided to take a step of faith to actually arrive and wait on God's promise. Now, years after arriving, Sarah and Abraham were still childless, and so they figured that perhaps they could hurry things along. And so Sarah took her handmaid, the second woman in our story, her name was Hagar, to go into Abraham's bed and bear them a child. And that is exactly what took place. In time, Hagar would give birth to a son. They named Abraham's firstborn Ishmael. It seemed as if all things were going on as planned until one day, 3 visitors came to visit Abraham and Sarah. Let's listen to the story that's presented by Nancy Coates, who is retelling our story. You will find this story in your own Bibles at Genesis chapter 18.
Like ghosts, desert spirits burst forth from the sand. They were silent, 3 regal shapes, casting short shadows in the blazing heat of the withering mid-afternoon. The old man had neither heard nor seen them before they were there. Unbearable, the senses dulled, eyes clouded, ears clogged, will blunted. Heat beyond imagining, beyond enduring. But the bony old man, seat clinging to his dusty cotton cloak, his face caked with centuries of desert dust, somehow roused himself to action, born of those same centuries' demand for service. With movement quicker than his feeble frame could sustain, he stood up to greet the strangers from the desert and ran, yes, ran to meet them, his toes nearly scraping the blast hard-packed earth. He may be a pitiable, childless old man, but he knew what custom demanded. He began the expected litany of the offer of a tiny, inadequate repast, a little water, a bit of bread, while his brain was composing the commands he would give for a sumptuous wilderness feast. He knew that the strangers knew this code of behavior well, but that hardly implied that one could go beyond the custom. Never. It was the custom that kept the old man together while his long life had continued, and while that long life had not been blessed with a son. Well, these strangers knew nothing of that, certainly, and would not care if they did. Just another old man, cursed with a barren wife, doomed to live out his last days with the certain knowledge that with his death would come the death of his name. There would be no memory of this old man. The strangers entered the coded language with the appropriate code-coded response. Do as you have said. The old man increased his remarkable activity, providing large portions of food and drink for the 3, then waiting while they ate it all. After the prescribed belch of satisfaction, the ultimate act of praise after a superb meal, the strangers politely asked after the old man's wife. This was customary once again, but the fact that the strangers knew her name was at the very least curious. One of the strangers assumed a well-nigh divine look about him and announced that he would return next spring, and his wife Sarah, though old, would have a son. Well, the old man remembered how he had laughed at that claim several times before, but out of politeness to the peculiar stranger, he kept his laughter to himself, as did Sarah. Oh, she heard what the stranger had said, but she knew what no stranger needed to know, although one look at her withered frame would tell all anyone needed to know. She was far beyond childbearing years. A son indeed. The very thought mocked her ancient worn frame. So she chuckled sneeringly to herself. Sure, she thought, a son for me in old age. Why did Sarah laugh? The divine one asked. A bemused smile on his face. I didn't laugh, the ancient woman lied. Yes, you did, chuckled the desert stranger, whose amazingly old features suddenly cracked into a broad guffaw as he shouted, Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? Hearing such unrestrained laughter, the old man and the old woman could not help themselves. They laughed too, and the next spring, the prune-faced pair had a son. They called him Laughter. Isaac. What else?
But don't you love the question that the visitor poses to Sarah? Is there anything too wonderful for the Lord? The reality is that Sarah is too old. So they thought that by having a child between Sarah's handmaid and Abraham, they would satisfy God's promise. By faith, they are now confronted with the reality that God's promise was and would be satisfied through Sarah and not Hagar. In time, ancient Sarah did conceive, and because she laughed at the thought of a child being born to her at her great age and was caught by the visitor, they named the child Isaac, which means laughter. As Isaac grew, and somewhere between the age of 18 months and 5 years, which is the normal time for a child to be weaned, biblical times according to the Talmud, Sarah seemed to grow jealous of Hagar's child playing with Isaac. So, fearing that Ishmael would supplant her son's right to Abraham's rightful heir, she tells Abraham to get rid of Hagar and the child. Now, this is disastrous for Hagar and her child. I mean, this is a person who has been intimately involved in their life for over 5 years. Let's hear her side of the story as told by Chris Summer.
If only I could find some water. This terrible desert is not a place to be without water. That miserable Abraham, his attempt to assuage his conscience with that tiny skin of water and a little bit of bread, is scant comfort to me and Ishmael. How could he treat his own firstborn like this? How could he treat me, the mother of the boy, like this? Why has he sent us into the desert to our certain deaths? What has gotten into him anyway? Well, of course, I know precisely what has gotten into him. It is that insane jealousy of his wife Sarah. I was as astonished as anyone when she managed to get pregnant at her age. I still suspect that there was some magic in it. Surely 90-year-old women do not get pregnant. It was still not too bad as long as the miracle child was a baby. The day the boy was weaned, however, the day of the feast, my Ishmael was doing nothing more than having a good time. He was laughing with pleasure at all of the fun, when from nowhere Sarah exploded, telling Abraham that he must throw me and my son, his son too, out into the wilderness. She saw us as some sort of a threat to the exclusive rights of her Isaac. I never said or even implied that Isaac was not a unique child who had the clear claim to be Abraham's heir. But Sarah was, I guess, taking no chances. She wanted us banished from her tents and from her life forever. I expected better from the father of my child. Surely he would defend me, and if not me, his firstborn son. I was astounded and enraged when he said nothing at all. He looked displeased, but I could not tell if he was displeased because of Sarah's cruel request, or because of the threat to our Ishmael, or because he found himself in an awkward position of having to choose between his children. He often was a maddeningly indecisive man. After hearing Sarah's demand for our death, Abraham left us alone. I later learned that he was convinced God told him that somehow our Ishmael was going to be the forebearer of a great nation. That, he felt, gave him the ability to make his choice, in effect, washing his hands of the whole affair. So he threw us out with that pathetic water skin and a tiny piece of old bread. I hope he's satisfied. I hope he can sleep at night having the death of his son on his conscience. I can't watch, so I set the boy down under the tree and I left him there. A blazing sun, a dying sun, and a desert grave. God, hide my eyes from the death of my son, and let my death be swift after his. Do not forget us, even while the world has already. We die as innocents. Hear my prayer. My son, would that we could both live.
As we come to realize, thresholds are not always positive experiences. Sometimes thresholds will take us from one place where we want to stay to take us to a place that we don't want to go. Anyone as a young child sitting outside of the principal's office knows exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes I think they leave you out there to stew a little longer so you can become even more anxious before you have to walk into the principal's office and explain whatever it was that landed you in that situation to begin with. But you all know what the feeling is like. We don't want to go there. Now, we're going to discuss how Hagar's situation plays out next Sunday. The reality of the situation is that Hagar lays down literally at the base of a tree some ways off from her son so she doesn't see her son die, and prays for a different reality for her and her son. Waiting by faith before the next step is disclosed to her, if you will. Now, there are several pivotal moments in the life of Abraham and Sarah. They leave what they know for a promise of what they don't know. God precedes them all the same. They could have stayed and not experienced the promise. And then, my friends, the question would be for you and me is that where would we be in that case? Because we're grafted into the line of Abraham and Sarah by virtue of Jesus Christ. In time, Abraham and Sarah took that bearing descendants thing into their own hands. I mean, they tried to manipulate the situation to live into God's promise. Imagine if they hadn't and they just waited. God's promise was to be happening through them, through Sarah. But they stepped through a threshold and created a line of descendants that were never part of the promise that God had made to them when they were back in the old land. Yet God would make a promise to those descendants, to Ishmael's descendants, and they would bring them out of a seemingly bad situation into something better. Imagine if Sarah never got jealous of her husband's firstborn son to begin with. I mean, who knows where we would be today? Perhaps there would be better relations between Isaac's descendants and Ishmael's descendants. The ancient Celts saw threshold moments as pivotal moments. Not just physically walking through doors, but metaphorically walking from one place in time to another place in time, or from one reality to another reality, from what was to what may become. Now, if we were to bring this into our current situation to this day and age, I would say that we have been standing on a threshold of COVID-19. The reality of this situation is that this is a terrible virus. It's killed over 115,000 Americans in 3 short months. Over 400,000 worldwide since last winter. When this came, we decided to step back from live in-person worship in concert with our governor's request. The reality was that if we continue to meet, then our congregation, of which we have a greater at-risk people, would suffer terribly. I mean, I suppose that if we were standing at that threshold of COVID-19, we could have wrung our hands and worry about how would we survive without our in-person meetings or our in-person worship. The community would just fritter away. Oh my, how fearful a reality that could have been, and how lacking in the faith of our membership. Because of the wonders of modern technology, we had the faith in our congregants and their desire to stay connected. We also trusted that God had a plan to bring out good out of this situation. So we stepped from what was very familiar into something that was very unfamiliar. I mean, providing streaming and online worship experiences, planning meetings, moved to Zoom, yay! And God started to use these online forums, YouTube, Facebook, to keep our community closer together. In fact, we have been growing despite the fact that we couldn't be in the same room together. In many ways, stepping across this threshold, we pivoted our services. And yes, I'll be the first to admit they were rough at first. The technology was all brand new to us. The challenges of service providers that failed at critical times, like Sunday morning at 10 a.m. And now we're finally getting things more smoothly. Still, there are glitches, but things are coming together well. I mean, look, we have had 3 virtual choir performances already, and they're amazing. And because we stepped out on faith, God has increased our impact. More people are joining us for worship locally and further away, and we even have friends in other countries that check in on us. Center&Main has become our new name here for that one which we once called Westminster United Methodist Church, because now we know firsthand that the church is not a place that we go to, it's who we are and where we are. God has moved us from one campus with 3 buildings to bring worship and praise into our very homes. We're celebrating the sacrament of Holy Communion together, virtually and remotely. Some say we couldn't, some say we shouldn't, but we've done it all the same, and we've seen how God's Spirit has bound us together, because we're not going to wring our hands and lament about not meeting. Because you know something, my friends? In the midst of all of this, God's kingdom is growing and thriving through the people who were once considered Westminster United Methodist Church. Now, my friends, this congregation is over 200 years old. And you know, a 200-year-old can't pivot too quickly, but we have. And the new reality, I think, is better than we could have ever expected it to have been. My friends, if this 200-year-old congregation can pivot to a new reality, then I think that we can expect better from our fellow citizens as well. In these last few weeks, our nation stands at a threshold where we have had to face some ugly realities that have been rooted in systematic racism and disproportionate violence visited upon Black and brown people, like that which was visited upon George Floyd. We have listened and heard cries of people who have faced these realities all of their life at the hands of people who have benefited because their skin color is a lighter shade of tan. The reality is all of us are standing at a threshold on the side of the door where pain and anguish endured by Black and brown people, and we have to decide if we're willing to jettison the past, a past that has been based upon hate and fear, encouraged by a racist society, one that is based on suspicion and brokenness, and even based upon slave-owning pasts and less than equal opportunity present. And my friends, we have to step by faith into what lies on the other side of the threshold, which is where God would have us to go. I mean, what do we have to lose? This journey will not be an easy one. By faith, let us walk into a reality that seems to be more in concert with Christ's teaching, to love God and neighbor in word and action. My friends, we've traveled from the threshold of Ireland into Iona, Scotland with Combe. We left behind the terrible realities of his role in his homeland for him to become the apostle to the Picts and the Scots with this brand of Celtic Christianity. We've seen how by faith, Sarah and Abraham have stepped from one threshold of leaving all that they knew to go to a land, to see the promise of God, to make them the mother and the father of a mighty nation, people called God's children. And next week, we're going to see the reality that awaits Hagar and her son. Sisters and brothers, what threshold is standing before you? It may not be an easy step for you. What I know is that the choice is yours. To take a step by faith, trusting that God already precedes you, as God has preceded Hagar and Sarah and Abe and even Comkiel. Amen to that. As we go into our breakout session now, I invite you to share what thresholds stand before you. As we return to live in-person worship here at Center&Main at the beginning of July, I ask you, what are we going to carry into this new reality that God has prepared for us for? What are we willing to jettison as we consider and we step into whatever comes our way come August? And my friends, as a nation, what thresholds, what reality do you have the fortitude to step in to make a new beginning, a new opportunity, to maybe leave behind what for some of us has been comfortable and familiar, but painful for others? For those of you on Facebook or YouTube, use your chat feature and share your thoughts together. We'll be back together in 5 minutes.
Celtic spiritual practice this week is, you guessed it, to become more aware. To become more aware of those thresholds that you encounter throughout each and every single day. This might be crossing through a doorway, or moving from one activity to another. Or it could even be the thresholds of the day, especially at dawn, which many of us are still asleep, or particularly at dusk when hopefully we're not asleep. To become aware of these transitions in our life. And what I want you to do is that when you encounter or become aware of a threshold, I want you to pause and offer a short prayer of gratitude. We should be praying and giving thanks to God for a lot of things in our life. And whenever we're faced with a transition or a threshold, this is the time that we need to trust in God's love, God's grace, and God's guidance all the more. Remembering that God is on the other side of that threshold, just as God is on this side. So let's step through those thresholds of our life and give thanks to God for that moment. As we close today's service, we're singing a song that is a particular favorite of mine. I learned of this song the first time I came to Westminster United Methodist Church, and that's because Chris Wood, a former pastor here in our congregation, lifted this song up as a brand new song, and it speaks about this being a day of new beginnings. It's acknowledging and setting aside the things of the past and stepping into something new, just as we talked about in today's message. Not being stuck on old prejudices and grudges and the past circumstances of life, but really to lean into the new possibilities of a new day that God is giving us. And so, my friends, as we sing our closing hymn, I'm going to invite you to stand and to celebrate that this is a new day. We give thanks to God for the past, and we look forward to the God of the future who guides us in and through these transitions, these thresholds. Let's sing. And so, my friends, we return from where we started, at the doorway, getting ready to step over the threshold, to go out into the world. And this is the opportunity that I've seen so many times where churches have taken signs and they place them over the top and it says, entering the mission field. We depart one place and we go into a new place. And so I'm sending you out with this benediction. Friends, in the rising of our hearts and our minds, let us go forth. The wisdom of the all-seeing Father be upon you, the patience of the all-loving brother as well, and the truth of the all-knowing Spirit. In the learning of the apostles, in the gracious guidance of the angels, in the patience of the saints, and in the self-control of the martyrs, for such is the path of all servants of Christ. Until we gather again, may God be with you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And all God's people said, Amen.